How do you follow an epic Pulitzer Prize-winning novel like The Overstory? Richard Powers will be here to talk about his new book, Bewilderment. What role does W.E.B. Du Bois play in the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois? Honoré Fanon Jeffers will join us to talk about her debut novel. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 1st. I'm Pamela Paul. Richard Powers joins us now from Knoxville, Tennessee. His new novel is Bewilderment, and of course his most recent novel, The Overstory, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Richard, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
This new novel, Bewilderment, has at its heart three people, one of them dead from the beginning of the novel, so we're not giving anything away. But tell us a little bit about these three characters, Theo Byrne, his son, Robin, and his late wife, Alyssa.
Theo is an astrobiologist, recently widowed, in his early 40s, and he has a 9-year-old son, Robin, who is neurodivergent, has received a couple of different diagnoses, but who is an intense, easily excitable, very lovable, but quick to anger and quick to fly into rage. And these two lost boys are making their way together after the death of Robin's mother and Theo's wife, Alyssa, a couple of years before the start of the novel.
You describe Robin or Robbie as neurodivergent, and it seems like a deliberate choice at the beginning of the novel that you don't label him in any other way, that you don't talk about, you don't even mention specifically what diagnoses that certain professionals have given him. That felt like a very deliberate choice.
Oh, it is. And Theo, who narrates the book, himself pushes back against any diagnoses that are too clinical or too specific. He's quite aware of a modern propensity to stop looking at the individual and start considering or reifying the category of the diagnosis. And it bears pointing out that diagnoses that are quickly, or easily passed along these days, such as Asperger's syndrome, aren't even recognized in the latest edition of the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Conditions. And Theo's feeling, I think, the one that sets the story in motion is nicely summarized at the beginning of the book, where he says, after a doctor tries to tell him, your son is on the spectrum, he wants to reply to the doctor, we're all on the spectrum. That's what a spectrum is. And we need to remember not to substitute that diagnosis for the individual involved.
There's also, it seems, that this relates to another theme in the novel, which is what is normalcy in psychological or human terms when society or the world is patently abnormal. And this was a little bit in The Overstory as well, but is more directly raised here.
It's a novel about empathy. It's really a kind of love story. It's a love story of a father for his strange son, a father who would do anything at all in his power to protect this boy from the world. And it's a love story of the son for his dead mother, who he has to now recreate through his own imagination. And it's also the love story of these two boys, two lost boys for the living world that's quickly receding from them. The novel explores those kinds of love through the question of empathy. What does it feel like to be someone very, very different from yourself? And how can you find empathy without requiring that other person to resemble you and to share the outlook on the world that you have?
I don't want to give away too much of the story, but part of that conversation around empathy, the idea of empathy, there's a lot of science in the book, but there's a not quite science part of this, which involves a speculative idea that enables people to experience that form of empathy as a kind of neurofeedback therapy. Can you describe the idea and how it works in the book?
It's based on a technique that's been around about a decade or so. I first read about it in 2013, called decoded neurofeedback. the idea is that a person involved in an activity, learning something or putting themselves into an emotional state, is recorded using fMRI in real time, and that recording is stored and used as a template for a subsequent person who is also being scanned in real time by fMRI and given feedback in the form of visual and auditory cues about whether they're close to the mental state of the template. So it's kind of like a game of blind man's bluff. You know, the machine is telling you warmer or colder. And through these feedback cues, the second subject gradually begins to approximate the same kind of neural activity as the original recorded subject. This technique exists. In the book, I push it out. I make it a bit more speculative and a bit more powerful than it is at the present. But who knows? You know, we may get there in time. But when I first read about it, I thought, holy cow, this is a kind of empathy machine. It's a kind of training in emotional intelligence. And it might just be the source of a fable about that old philosophical chestnut. You know, what does it feel like to be something other than myself, someone other than myself? When Robin undergoes this technique, he gradually learns how to get beyond his anger and his rage and to open up to the possibility of interbeing, of reciprocal relationships with other kinds of people and other kinds of creatures. And that's what propels the story, which is a kind of flowers for Algernon, if you will, not for cognitive intelligence, but for emotional intelligence.
You just preempted my next question, which was to say, would it be accurate to call this book a kind of variation or a reinterpretation of Flowers for Algernon? Actually, let's just talk about that book for a moment in case some of our listeners may be unfamiliar with it, what it is that you wanted to tease out there.
It's a classic science fiction story. It started as a short story, and Daniel Keyes, the author, later rewrote it as a novel. And it was also turned into the film Charlie. It's about a scientific experiment that grants a not exceptionally bright person a sudden increase in his cognitive ability. And it becomes a kind of fairy tale about, this sudden, huge enhancement in the ability to understand and navigate the world. And, I read the story when I wasn't much older than my 9-year-old Robbie in Bewilderment, and it captivated me. And I hadn't looked at it again until discovering this decoded neurofeedback made me think about that trajectory, the arc of that fable. And when I went back to the Key story, I was really intrigued at his use of an epigraph from Plato's Republic. It's something like the eye knows two kinds of bewilderment, going into the light and leaving it. Of course, it's from Plato's allegory of the cave, and the idea that if we somehow escape the shackles of our limited forms of perception and step out into the outside, we're going to be momentarily blinded by the brightness of the sun. But of course, when we turn back into the cave to tell our fellows that we've mistaken our fantasies for reality, we're also going to be blinded by being plunged back into the dark. And Keyes' story is a reworking of Plato's cave, and in a sense, Bewilderment is also, but from the standpoint of emotions rather than intelligence.
There's this other kind of parallel question that you seem to be asking in the book, which is what's more mysterious or what's less known or what is less knowable? The world out there, the world of the astrobiology world of Theo Byrne, the father, or the world inside our own minds, inside each of us?
Yes, Theo is an astrobiologist, and one of the things that he's discovered that can calm his son is a kind of ritual of bedtime stories in which he takes his son with him on imaginary visits to other planets where life, being presented with radically different conditions, evolves in radically different ways. And father and son explore these planets as a kind of therapy, as a kind of indirect way of coming to terms with the challenges in their own life. And the question really intrigues Robin, this idea that the central challenge of astrobiology is life everywhere, or are we alone? And if it is everywhere, where is everybody? You know, that classic question called the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so old and so big, why do we seem to be the only show in town? And these journeys to other planets gradually turn from an outward journey to an inward one. And father and son, by the end of the book, both reach a place where they realize that alien life is everywhere and it's all around us. And it's only we who have become blind to it and have to find ways back outward into the neighborhood.
It felt like each of these stories for the father, and maybe perhaps for you, felt like a kind of interesting exercise in, well, what if the world were this way? What if the world were like ours, but different in this respect or in that respect?
That is both the central preoccupation of astrobiology, which is a brand new, burgeoning field, only a couple of decades old. If there are all of these millions of exoplanets out there, and they are all subject to radically different conditions, what would life look like in these conditions that are so very different from Earth? But it, of course, is also the preoccupation of most literature. I mean, books themselves are empathy machines and travels to other planets. They're ways that we have of participating in sensibilities that are not ours. So when Robin asks this question, which is bigger, outer space or inner? That question of where are we going? Who are we? Why are we the way we are? Gets turned inward to this question of how do I understand someone who's so profoundly different from myself? And in that way, travel to other planets always becomes travel to other people.
This is clearly a novel that takes place in a world post 2016, in which felt like almost like a slightly altered reality, like just a slightly fictionalized, perhaps a second or a third Trump administration. And I'm interested if you were, as a writer and human being, actively working out your own thoughts and reactions to that political moment.
Oh my goodness, yeah. The novel is in a lot of ways a pandemic novel. It's a lockdown novel. It's something that was produced in quarantine in my home in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. And I wrote it in the final years of the Trump administration. And I actually submitted the final draft before the 2020 election. And the book is really fraught with the questions and the fears that were plaguing me in those months and years. And you're right to say that it unfolds on something like the Earth in those years. I mean, science fiction loves to play with this form, the near future, in which the story is set in some indesigate point just slightly beyond ours, where we can tweak the rules a little bit and introduce technologies that haven't yet surfaced. Well, this book I thought about as a kind of near present, just as Robin and Theo are exploring all these alternate planets. The book itself, Bewilderment, is a kind of exploration of an alternate Earth, a what-if Earth. And so I do deflect the trajectory of recent years in a way that estranges them, I think, just enough to make us realize how bizarre and terrifying and precarious the time that we've just come through is, and that the time that we're living in right now. It's that kind of deflection of the Earth's orbit, I think, that gives this book a strangeness and a kind of alternate reality.
How has living in the Smoky Mountains changed you as a writer?
Oh, it's completely stood my own personal routine on its head. I've been at it for a long time. This is my 13th novel. My first novel was published in 1985, so that's getting on close to 40 years of novel writing. And throughout most of those years, I was a very disciplined and structured writer. I would get up in the morning and I wouldn't leave the writing desk until I had my 1,000 words. And then I was off the leash and could do as I saw fit. Moving to the Smokies, for the first time in my life, I have a direct engagement with where I live. It's not arbitrary. I've become conscious of what creatures I share the place with, what the land wants to do, what's native and what isn't native and what the affordances of that place are. And unlike the rest of my writing life, which was kind of, I might as well be in a hotel with a suitcase somewhere and just sitting at a computer, I now feel like the writing is coming out of the place. And instead of saying, I'll get my 1,000 words and then see what happens, I open the window and look outside and smell it and see what the weather is. And if it's a beautiful day, the walking comes first, or the swimming in the mountain rivers comes first. And that's made a huge difference. I mean, Bewilderment is, I think, different from anything else that I've ever written. And it has something to do with that change in process. It has something to do with inverting that relationship between writing and living.
So interesting, because many people would think that the Overstory would have affected you most fundamentally because of its tremendous success and winning the Pulitzer and the critical and popular reception. But it actually sounds like it influenced you and your work on a much deeper level.
Well, I can't pretend that I wasn't changed by the very different reception that Overstory had. And there is a way. I mean, you reach an age, I'm 64 now, and that book gave me anything that a writer could ask for. And there was a moment where I just realized I'm in the bonus round now, and that's a complete liberation. Larry Bird once said that when you make a really good shot, you've earned the right to miss from anywhere on the court. And, there is something to that. If something comes off the way that you imagine it, and it feels like a kind of culmination of what you've been working toward, I think I have gotten additional encouragement and power from simply saying, you've earned the right to take another chance and to set off in a different direction. But I do think that this change in locale and the change in my relationship to place and to the non-human, which came from writing Overstory, is probably more important to me with regard to how I think about my day and how I think about my day's work than anything that happened in the reception of the previous book.
Well, here's to an extended bonus round. Richard, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Richard Powers' newest novel is called Bewilderment. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So, since the Nobel Prize in Literature is going to be announced next week, I thought I'd look back at some old news of Nobel Prizes. And I have to say my favorite one is actually a pretty recent one. It's from 2007, and it's when Doris Lessing was awarded the prize. We clearly sent a reporter to her London home, and here's how it unfolded. She had been out. She was carrying a bunch of shopping bags. She looked harassed and harried. And here's our description. Miss Lessing learned of the news from a group of reporters camped on her doorstep as she returned from a visit to the hospital with her son. I was a bit surprised because I had forgotten about it, actually, she said. My name has been on the short list for such a long time. As the persistent sound of her ringing phone came from inside the house, Ms. Lessing said that on second thought, she was not surprised because, quote, this has been going on for something like 40 years, unquote, referring to the number of times she has been mentioned as a likely honoree. Either they were going to give it to me sometime before I popped off or not at all. After a few moments, Ms. Lessing, who is stout, sharp, and a bit hard of hearing, excused herself to go inside. I'm going to go answer my telephone, she said. I swear I'm going upstairs to find some suitable sentences, which I will be using from now on. I love this, and I will tell you, Pamela, I know you know there's a video of this too.
It's one of the best videos on the internet, as far as I'm concerned.
It is, and I encourage everyone to go find it. What the Times story doesn't include is the very first thing she says when she sees this massive group of reporters outside her home is, "Oh, Christ."
Yeah, she's incredibly annoyed.
She's very annoyed.
I love
yes.
it. I love
do
it.
Too.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Honoré Fanon Jeffers joins us now from Norman, Oklahoma. Her new book and her debut novel is called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. It is an Oprah Book Club pick. It debuted at number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. Very much a huge hit out the gate. Honoré, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, this is your debut novel, but it's not your first book. It's your sixth book. Your first five books were collections of poetry. One of them, The Age of Phyllis, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Poetry. And your father was a poet. Did you always know that that's what you were going to do?
Oh, absolutely not. Um, my father was a very brilliant man, and he cast a very big shadow. So I tried everything I could do not to be a poet, but it just grabbed hold of me over the years and wouldn't let go.
Talk a little bit about your father and his work as a poet. He was a part of the Black Arts movement.
Yes. Yes, he was. And whenever I would meet other Black Arts Movement poets, they would always make sure to let me know I would never be the writer that he was.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yes, he was a very brilliant man. He was a college professor. He had 2 degrees from Columbia. But I would say that my mother was even smarter than he was. But because her background was different and her affect was different. She spoke with a Southern drawl the way that I do, and she was 14 years younger than he was. A lot of people didn't really see how brilliant she was. And so, in some ways, I feel like I'm carrying her legacy forward more than he is.
And it's interesting then, this is very much a book about women and about matriarchy. Is that in part a sort of tribute to your mother?
Yes, and to other Black women of the Deep South. I grew up partially in Durham, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia, but every summer we would travel to Eatonton, which is the home, Eaton, Georgia, which is the home of my mother. And the women were very much present in that community. They did the child rearing, they transferred cultural knowledge, they made sure we went to church, they pinched us in church if we didn't behave. So, yes, it's very much a tribute to Black Southern women and the kind of Black Southern women I grew up around, which is deeply brown, dark brown Black women.
And colorism is one of the many themes in this book. But let's talk about your main character, a woman, Ailey Pearl Garfield. Who is she?
Ailey is a child of privilege. She's the child of Dr. Jeff Louis Garfield and Belle Driscoll Garfield. And she grows up in an unspecified urban environment called the city. We never really know because I wanted to make sure that that was sort of vague. But Chickasetta is always considered her true home. And so she's tugged back and forth, not only in terms of her feelings and her identification between the city and Chickasetta, Georgia, but also in terms of class, in terms of outlook, in terms of what she's going to do with her life. Is she going to follow a talented 10th Black bourgeoisie career path, or is she going to do something else?
Well, I hope it's not revealing too much to say that though she's born into a family of medical doctors, she decides to become a historian, which feels like a very deliberate choice in a book in which history plays such a big part.
I don't think it's a spoiler. Just about everybody in every review has talked about that. And I think it's a gesture to the way that I grew up learning about African American history. I'm an English professor, creative writing professor. But when I was a little girl, I would sit up underneath the old people. I never really was a child that liked to play with other children, and I would sort of scoot into a corner so I wouldn't be noticed. And I would listen to the old people talk about the way they grew up, growing up in segregation, growing up in Jim Crow, and then some of the stories that they remembered from the old people who had been born into slavery, like my great grandma Mandy Napier. So it had a great impact on me. And I think that's why I made Ailey an eventual historian.
The book covers a lot of ground in many senses, physically, temporally. But let's talk about the physical. You mentioned the city, which is in the north. Chickasetta is a fictional town, right, in Georgia. Is that based on where your mother grew up?
Yes, it is. When I was in graduate school, I missed Black communities like that, traditional, really small, deep South where everybody knows everybody's business. People don't really call before they come by. They just come and holler through the screen. I miss that. And so I created a fictional town, but it is based upon Eatonton, Georgia, which is in Putnam County, and where my mother grew up and where Alice Walker grew up. My mother taught Alice Walker,
Wow.
the writer, back in junior high school.
What is the role of setting in this novel? I mean, it feels very deliberate. You have a fictional small town, you have an unnamed northern city.
Well, I always hesitate before I start bringing up Toni Morrison because I don't want anybody to think I'm considering myself to be an equal to Toni Morrison. But I remember once in an interview, Toni Morrison talked about when we write about Black communities, these are not simply regional, these are not marginal. These are very much a part of American society. I wanted people, and not only just non-Black people, but African Americans, to understand that Southern Black communities are still thriving, and we are part of the American landscape. We are very much a part of how this country has evolved in the good and the bad. And so I wanted to make a very overt gesture toward that particular point of view.
Well, you brought up Toni Morrison. I'm going to bring up the name of another great Black American women writer, Lucille Clifton. Can you talk a little bit about her work and what it's meant to you, and also what she as a person has meant to you?
Miss Lucille was part of that gathering of Black Arts Movement poets, the circles that my parents moved in the late 60s and the early 70s. She said that she had met me as a little girl, but I didn't remember that. And then later on, I submitted a book for a prize, the Stan and Tom Wick Prize for First Book of Poetry, and she was the judge, and she picked my book. And at the press, Kent State University Press, they said, well, let us give you her phone number so you can call and talk to her. And that was probably the worst mistake they ever made, but so great for me. And so I called her up, and she was just so warm and kind, and what we call down south, even though Miss Lucille wasn't from the South, we call that just plain folks. She didn't have that sort of sound to her voice like I am an important person. She was just a regular, wonderful person who was also incredibly brilliant. And I would just call her, because I didn't have any sense back then. And so I would call her up every now and then and be like, hey, Miss Lucille, what you doing? And she'd say, hey, Ani. And that's my nickname. And we would talk, and we would talk about mostly life. We didn't talk a lot about poetry, but she was a deeply spiritual woman, like a non-denominational spiritual woman. And she was a visioning woman. And I was coming into my own spirituality, and I had started having visions. I'm a little hesitant to talk about that because people will say stuff like, well, there's medication for that, that kind of thing. But she really became my North Star. And I was deeply troubled back then, and that's all I'll say. I'm a private person. But she knew that I needed a lot of care. And so she was just always there for me. And I loved her very, very much. And she told me once that she had a vision of what would come to pass, not for my poetry, but for my fiction. She told me she has seen very great things for me. And she was a maternal figure for me, my second mother. So I thought she was just shining me on, like a mom will say when somebody picks at you at elementary school. They're just jealous of you because you're so pretty, or something like that. But when Miss Oprah called me and told me that she was picking my book for her book club, I thought back on what Miss Lucille had said. And it was something.
What was that moment like for you when it's Oprah Winfrey on the phone?
Well, it was funny because I thought somebody was playing a joke on me. And so the first thing when I saw the unfamiliar number on my phone, I just ignored it. So I said, well, I don't know who this is, so I'm not going to answer the phone. Then it popped up again, and I thought maybe it's one ex-boyfriend, trying to talk to me. I get that every once in a while. When you're 54, you have a few, folks from your past. So I picked up the phone and I said, hello. This lady's voice said, may I speak to Honoré Jeffers? And I said, who is this? Very gruff. And that's not who I am. I'm, very gracious, or I try to be. That's how my mama raised me. And the voice said, this is Oprah Winfrey. And I said, no, it's not. And stopped playing on my phone. And the person kept saying, this is Oprah Winfrey. And I kept saying, no, it's not. And then all of a sudden, she got this bass to her voice. And she said, this is Oprah Winfrey. And I said, oh my God, it was really surreal. And then she told me she was picking the book for the book club, and I cried. And I thought about Miss Lucille in that moment.
You've described this book as a Black feminist novel. What does that mean to you? And in what ways did you carry on that tradition in this book?
Well, one of the people who I return to over and over is the great Alice Walker, who defined womanism as Black feminism in an essay that is in her groundbreaking book of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Garden. One of the things about Black feminism is it doesn't simply mean that you're paying attention to female empowerment or female identified empowerment. It also means that you are paying attention to the health of the community. That means everybody of any gender in Black communities, you want to make sure they're okay. So issues of mass incarceration, issues of the well-being of children, social justice issues, issues of food scarcity. Although Alice Walker identified that when she began talking about womanism, Black women in particular have always done this, going all the way back to when we arrived here in the Americas. And so I wanted to show, I think, the hidden lives of Black women. We have not only held it down for our communities, we have held it down for this country. All you have to do is look at the last election and look at Black women organizers in Black communities, political organizers getting out the vote. And so I wanted people to really understand that though we have been in the background, this community and indeed this country would be nothing without Black women.
I'm interested in your decision to fictionalize certain aspects of this novel and then in others, very real figures like W.E. Du Bois. We haven't even talked about him, but we'll get to that. And now that you bring up Spelman College, you have a historically Black college that figures in the book, but it's not Spelman. How did you decide when to add that fictionalizing element to a place or an institution or person and when to go with the historical record?
When I decided to choose particular aspects of history and not fictionalize them, those were the moments that I felt like readers needed to understand this is real. When we think about, in America, for example, the Trail of Tears, the Native American Trail of Tears, where the 5 southeastern Native American tribes were wrenched from their homeland and taken out here to Oklahoma. Very few people are aware of this history. And so that was the history that I felt couldn't be fictionalized. It had to be real so that people could not turn away from it. The Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, that was an aspect of history that I felt like people couldn't turn away from. The Federal Road that was forced through Native American lands, but was also used for what is called by historians the Second Middle Passage after the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the United States. Then there became a new slave trade that came through the South. These are issues that I felt could not be fictionalized. But in terms of, for example, using Rutledge College instead of naming a real college, as somebody who graduated from Talladega College, I knew that there would be classmates of mine going through the book trying to figure out who it was that I was naming. And so I didn't want to get in trouble because all of those people are fictionalized. I can't even remember, I graduated from Talladega in 1989. I can't even remember half of those people's names, 3/4 of those people's names. And then also, there were things that some conservative people might find uncomfortable, things like intimate relationships between young folks. And I just felt like that wouldn't be fair to be, or legal to be.
There's also that.
There's also that, yes.
Let's talk about a very real figure who is in the title of the book, W.E.B. Du Bois. And maybe first tell us about when you first encountered his work and what it meant to you.
Both of my parents were highly educated, and both of them were readers. My father was a published poet, as you've mentioned. My mother was a secret writer, and they were really deep into African American literature going all the way back. And I guess I was in junior high school when I first encountered The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. One of my parents gave me the book, and they stressed, I do remember this, what an important man he was. I'm pretty sure I didn't understand everything I was reading when I first read The Souls of Black Folk. But I returned to this book throughout the years. When I was in college, one of the things that I noticed was that at my historically Black college, Talladega College, people read Du Bois in nearly every course, in history, in literature, if they were social work majors, if they were in political science classes, preparing to go to law school. He loomed really large. It was later when I was at a majority white graduate school that I discovered, to my shock, that there were people that I was attending graduate school with, non-Black people, who had never heard of W.B. Du Bois. And so it was then that I got the inkling that the sort of education and exposure to Black figures of African American history, that this was not a common exposure. This was something that I had been exposed to, having been reared in a Black middle class enclave and mostly just being among other Black people. That's when I began to understand who he was. And then one of the things that I noticed was that he had this great love for Southern Black people. And as my love increased, at first I had been very embarrassed by, their country ways and the way that they talked and all of that. But as I began to change my attitude, I began to draw closer to the works of W.B. Du Bois.
Well, we've talked about W.E. Du Bois. I have more to ask about him, but you mentioned love, and so it brings me back to your title, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Why is it called that? Obviously, there's the reference in there to Eliot.
I think people assume that I have a reference to Eliot, but I don't.
Ah, all right, a correction.
Well, let me say this. Yes and no. It's sort of side-eye. People assume that modernism began with T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. But in reality, W.B. Du Bois predates both T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. W.E.B. Du Bois is the founder of American modernism. The Souls of Black Folks comes out in 1903, which is well before their works come out. So I'm always sort of challenging people to rethink what we believe we know about American history, American literary history. So yes, that's a gesture, but a side-eye gesture.
I like that side-eye.
to T.S. Eliot. But the love songs refers to several aspects of love. It's the sorrow songs, what W.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs, which are the traditional spirituals that were composed by enslaved African Americans, probably around the 19th or early 19th century. It is a gesture to his love for Southern Black people. It is a gesture to my love for Black women. It's a love letter to Southern Black women and the devotion that I have to them. And finally, the love in the title is a hopeful gesture that somehow folks of different races in this place we call America, to reference the great poet Saint Sanchez. She always uses that term. This place we call America. That somehow we'll get it together and we will have love. That sounds corny, but I feel like if we don't get it together, then we're all going to fall together. We either keep going together or we are going to destroy this American experiment. So there are a lot of different aspects of love referenced in the title.
Well, that's a perfect place to end and a perfect place for people to start reading this novel if they haven't already. This love letter, as you put it. The book, again, is called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fanon Jeffers. Honorée, such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
My colleagues John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what they're reading. Hey, guys.
Hey,
Hey,
Pamela.
Pamela.
John, tell us what you're reading.
I chose a book to talk about this week that is probably setting a high bar for myself because this is a very hard book to describe. It's called When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, who is a writer who was born in Rotterdam but has lived in Chile since he was a teenager. And this book is translated from the Spanish. It was actually just nominated. It was longlisted for the National Book Award for Translated Literature. It is an elliptical book. It's a book that has been compared to Sebald, and that I have a comparison I'm going to make in a minute. It's about essentially the limits and the dangers of science. That's probably the briefest way you could describe it. It's a mix of fiction and nonfiction. It's not very long. It's less than 200 pages. It covers a lot of ground. It starts with the scientists who created some of the things that led to some of the horrors of the 20th century: gas warfare and the First World War, nuclear warfare. And these very beautifully written, slightly fictionalized capsules of these people's lives with a very grim accounting of where this science led them, both personally and where it led the world. It reminds me in a way of Jeff Dyer's book, But Beautiful, which is a very different book, but it is also a blend of fiction and nonfiction about the lives of certain famous jazz musicians. It's also very beautifully and elegantly written. And what Labatut does here is there's a great sort of 6 or 7 minute video on YouTube where he describes the book in English. He's very eloquent about it. He calls it a strange book about strange ideas, and that it's about the limits of science and the limits of understanding, and about how science is about what happens after the epiphany. After these great discoveries, what does it do to people? I'm about halfway through it and going fairly quickly because, like I said, it's not very long. I would highly recommend it based on the first half. But what I would say is that you have to be in a mood where your constitution is strong enough to take the underlying tone, which is one of, I find it very depressing, but also very beautiful. It's highly literary. It's been written about. We have our own review coming. John Banville wrote about it for The Guardian, which gives you a sense of the style of it.
Well, you're a highly literary guy, John.
In my better moments. Greg, what are you reading?
I'm also reading a fairly short book, a very short book, really. It's On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed. It's maybe like 130 pages long, and they're short pages. It's a small book, almost more like a stocking stuffer than a book. So it feels like it could have been just a long essay more than a book. The size and the title, On Juneteenth, make you think it might be like a monograph looking at this African-American holiday, Juneteenth, when emancipation finally came to Texas on June 19th, 1865. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and after the official end of the Civil War, just because news spread so slowly then, and there were still hostilities breaking out, skirmishes, even after the official end of the Civil War. But when it was clear that the Confederacy was going to lose, finally word reached Texas that, in fact, the slaves had been freed. And that is Juneteenth. Annette Gordon-Reed is a historian. She teaches at Harvard, but she grew up in Texas. She's African-American herself. She grew up celebrating Juneteenth. She's a Pulitzer winner for a biography that she wrote of Sally Hemings and the Hemings family, the Hemingses of Monticello. And what she's doing in this book is really interesting. It's not a monograph at all because, in fact, it goes in all different directions. It's very wide-ranging and very intimate and personal at times. She talks about her own childhood in Texas. She was the first Black to attend an all-white elementary school, so she integrated that school, but kind of very quietly. She found out later it had been carefully negotiated between her parents and the school administrators, and nobody made a big deal out of it. There was no press. She shone at that school. She was on the honors list. But she talks about always being aware of everybody's eyes on her, and it kind of drove her to perform. So she really brings herself to this story, which is a story of Texas and of African Americans in Texas, and the history of slavery and emancipation, but also Texas's history overall and Texas's mythology overall as the decade that it spent as a free republic when it broke away from Mexico, and how tied up that was with slavery. The mythology of Texas as part of the American West, the cowboy mentality, And she delves into all of this and looks at how it relates to American history overall and the role that Texas plays in the American mythos and in just American race relations. She talks not only about African Americans in relation to white supremacy and kind of the colonial frontier spirit. She talks obviously about Mexico and Hispanics in America, about indigenous Americans, the Native Americans that were in Texas before the white settlers came. It's funny because she talks about part of the myth of Texas and the reality of Texas is how big it is and how proud they are in their bigness. And yet this is wafer thin book, as Monty Python would have it. It's it is tiny, and it just puts your mind going in so many directions. She talks about the link between capitalism and white supremacy. She says if capitalism was really just about maximizing profit, then the white store owners in her town would have no problem accepting black dollars. It would increase their bottom line, but they wouldn't let the blacks come and shop there because it wasn't only about maximizing profit. It was also about self-image and being better than other people. So it's a book that gets you thinking kind of on all these different levels in a very short amount of space. She just touches on a tremendous amount of things. I said that you might almost think of it more as an essay than a book, but she thinks of it as an essay collection. She says in the introduction that in these essays, I will touch on the various things. And you can read each chapter as a standalone essay, but they all really work together. In some ways, it makes a case for taking the history of Africans in America even further back than Jamestown in 1619, as the Times did in the 1619 project, back to the 1500s and the early days of Spanish settlers and explorers in Texas. It's just a remarkable accomplishment, and it's very nimble and very personal. She's got a really engaging, easy style, even as she's challenging American concepts of itself, America's concepts of itself. It's a book I would strongly recommend, whether you've read The Hemmingses of Monticello and Gordon Reed's earlier work or not.
Yeah, I had only read a round about The Hemmingses of Monticello because there was so much good writing and reporting about it. But it was interesting to read this book and get her more personal voice, and the stuff about just the more memoiristic stuff about growing up in Texas and her family is really great. Pamela, are you reading something short this week like Greg and I?
You knew I was. I take your short and I make it shorter, Greg, because I'm going to talk about two books, and one of them is super duper short. It is Congratulations, By the Way, by George Saunders. The subtitle is Some Thoughts on Kindness, and it's so short as to almost not be a book. It was, in fact, a speech, a single speech to a graduating class at Syracuse where Saunders is a professor. And I read it, I don't know. First of all, my husband was reading Saunders' more recent book, which is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is a real-sized book, if I might say, that is about a number of short stories, Russian short stories. So he was in deep Saunders and I was in light Saunders. But I sort of read it too because, well, first of all, I thought I could use some thoughts on kindness. I was having what felt like an unkind week. And so I read it for that. And I want to say, I am pro these books. I am pro this. I am pro the Amanda Gorman book that was just her inaugural poem. I think that the world would probably be a better place if instead of people bringing, I don't know, a candle as like a housewarming gift, that they bring along a little micro book like this. You know, who burns all those candles anyway? I don't know. All those candles are not necessary. And then the other book I read was not long, and it was based, in fact, on a series of articles in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in the early 20th century. And that book is called A Motor Flight Through France by Edith Wharton. I think I picked this up at the Mount. The Mount, Edith Wharton's former home, which is in the Berkshires, has a really great bookstore. And this book is reprinted by Northern Illinois University Press, but it was originally published by Scribner's. It intrigued me right now because I'm actually setting off to France soon, not on a motor flight. And that phrase intrigued me. And what is interesting about this book is that this is Wharton's travelogue of going around by car in France, which was considered to be like a crazy innovation at the time. And she writes a lot about what this new format of travel does to the way in which tourists make their way through the countryside. And it's interesting because none of this would occur really necessarily to us, but for her, it's really breaking free of the tyranny of trains. Because with trains, of course, you have to go from station to station. You're only going along set routes. You're beholden to the train schedules, and you spend lots of time idling away in the train station, waiting for trains to arrive or belated trains. And this frees the driver, the traveler, to set their own course.
I feel like I should tell Edith about walking.
Yes, walking is also new. Also new. Well, car travel was so new at that time that there weren't windshields. So when they travel, they get laryngitis, because they're shouting into the wind. And, she doesn't even write about what their hair looks like at the end of a speedy jaunt. And I think they're probably going around at about 30 miles an hour. In other ways, though, the book is so old-fashioned, even though it's about this crazy new technology, in that, unlike contemporary travel writing, she never mentions a single person. There are no people in any of these places. There's no food to be eaten. There's no shopping that's done. It's never about funny stories that happen. Instead, it's a very serious discussion of the assorted churches and cathedrals in each town, and occasionally the walled structure of a walled city or another large monument. But it's hard to imagine this book appealing to anyone who has not taken at least a few classes of art history or architectural history so that they know the transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic and are interested in subjects like flying buttresses, because that is really all she talks about. So it would probably be slightly boring, unless you're really interested in churches to most readers. There's no color, so to speak, in this book. But I found that actually to be the great interest of it, that it's not so much about the way in which she describes these places as putting you there and making you feel like, oh, wow, I'm in Carcassonne as I read, but more as a kind of historiography. It's a history of travel writing as a genre and the way in which it's evolved.
Well, I might not pick it up, but I will definitely be saying to someone in the coming days, do you want to take a quick motor flight into town?
I really do feel that is a term that should be revived, don't you?
Yes, I agree
Let's
completely.
all take a motor flight. Before we go, I want to raise a question that was sent to us from one of our listeners. This is from Anne Yakshaw in Columbus, Ohio, and she asks, how do you decide when to give an author a second chance after bouncing off that author's work, particularly when it's a well-loved or classic author? When it came out, I read Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant, and it didn't click for me at all. It was my first and only book of his, but I plan to give him another try someday. Oh my God. Anne, please do. But last year, I read Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye, and that experience was my long goodbye to Raymond Chandler. Didn't like the characters, didn't like the style, didn't like the misogyny, didn't like anything. I can't imagine ever giving Chandler a second look, his reputation notwithstanding. When you dislike an author's work, what makes you want to give that author a second chance? And when do you write that author off forever? Thoughts? I have thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts.
That's such an interesting question. For me, a lot of it has to do with other people's reactions. If it doesn't speak to me, and yet I've read really convincing arguments for what an author has going for him or her, I will set it aside and probably revisit it later and see if it speaks to me any better later in life, depending on the reasons that I put it aside in the first place.
Time of life, I think, is a good part of the answer.
But also, I would say there are a lot of really great authors out there. And if somebody doesn't speak to you, you don't need to go back. There will always be somebody else who might speak to you more. Sometimes it's enough to read around in somebody or to read the commentary about somebody to understand what they're contributing without devoting hours of your life into that person's catalog.
I agree. The first part of my answer was just going to be that life is short. So, I don't torture myself into trying to get someone if I don't feel like they're for me, even if they're great. I'm perfectly willing to admit that in many cases I'm the problem. And especially if someone is a classic author who survived centuries, I'm probably the one missing something, and that's fine. But it's funny that she writes about Ishiguro, because the first Ishiguro I read was Never Let Me Go, which, and we'll get angry letters to my address, just I really didn't enjoy, and I actually didn't finish. But given that he's Ishiguro, I read Remains of the Day a few years after that and really, really liked it. And I might read more by him. But the point is that I think it's a little bit arbitrary who you give it another chance and who you don't. I had a sense that I would like Ishiguro's stuff from the things my friends had said about it. It just seemed like it was unlikely that I wouldn't like some of his books, so I wanted to try again. I just had a conversation with another good friend about Penelope Fitzgerald, who I've read, I think, 3 of her novels over the years, and I really, really admire them. I can see why people think she's a great writer, but there's something about them that for some reason, even though on paper she makes sense to be like, a pillar of mine, I'm not a total fevered fan, but I will probably keep reading her throughout my life just to see if that ever takes, and because reading them is enjoyable on some level, and I do admire her, so why not try to reach that higher state with her?
I agree with you, John. I feel like the problem is often me, when I don't like a book. And there was a class that I took in college. I've probably mentioned this before. I really hated the professor, and she's alive and well and quite famous, so I won't name her. But I hated her. I hated every class. It wasn't just that I was bored. It was like I was actively antagonized by everything that she said and everything that she assigned in 2 of those books. I know some listeners are going to know exactly what class
this was. People are going to be madly Googling.
Yeah, and everyone else loved this class, just for the record. So obviously I was the problem, I guess. I won't go that far. But I do think that I did take it out on the books that she assigned. I also think that she assigned probably the wrong books to read of these authors' work for the first time. So she assigned To the Lighthouse. I think I read 3 pages and I was like, I am never reading Virginia Woolf again, which I know is like a crime. It's a thought crime for any woman who's gone to university in the last 30 years. So I say that knowing they'll send mail to my address too, John. But I am intending to finally give Virginia Woolf a second chance. I have a copy of Mrs. Dalloway. I am intending to read it very soon. Another book that she assigned was The Golden Bowl by Henry James. I also stopped reading it, despised it. It's funny now, it's mentioned in Beautiful World, Where Are You?, the new book by Sally Rooney. And she is an author who I read about 20 pages of conversations with friends, and then I gave my copy to Greg. I said, you can have it. I'm done. And so I am changing my mind there, but I'll talk about that on a future podcast since I haven't finished that book yet. With Henry James, I realized I'm a total idiot. Like, how insane is that to write off Henry James? And later in my 20s, I went back and I read first Portrait of a Lady, and which is just one of the best books I've ever read. And since then, I've been regularly going back. I think I talked about The Americans on the podcast last year, and I talked recently about some of his ghost stories. So I was the problem.
Well, I mean, that point of entry is so important. And I think a lot of times starting with The Golden Bowl with James is somewhat of a strange choice, especially for younger readers who aren't. I mean, yes, I know a lot of people who are very sophisticated readers, but most people need a little bit of an entry ramp before they get to the most difficult stuff.
People who are not highly literary, unlike you. People like you, Pamela, who are lowly.
No. I mean, I was bored.
Literary.
I think the first time I read James was something much more accessible than The Golden Bowl, and I was bored out of my mind. I was not a super sophisticated reader.
I'm thinking of your Virginia Woolf problem, Pamela, and I'm thinking that for Mrs. Dalloway, I did something.
My Virginia Woolf problem.
I did something sneaky with my 16-year-old daughter, which was I had her read Michael Cunningham's The Hours first, and then I said, "Oh, maybe you should also read Mrs. Dalloway now after it." and then she was making all the connections and saying, "Oh, I see what So it worked that way, and now she likes
real
Virginia Woolf.
jujitsu parenting move.
Yeah.
All right. Anne Yakshaw, thanks for the question and for wringing all these embarrassing anecdotes out of us. And John, Greg, let's go down the list of books we read.
I read When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut.
I read On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed.
And I read Congratulations, By the Way by George Saunders and A Motor Flight Through France by Edith Wharton. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.